Seoul, South Korea, November 1997. A 41-year-old bank manager named Ji-ho is signing the paperwork on a refinanced mortgage for his apartment in the Mapo district. He has worked at the same institution for 14 years. He has a company pension, a car on installment plan, and a son enrolled at Yonsei University. Every financial decision he has made has followed the logic of a system that, until very recently, showed no visible signs of failing. The IMF would announce its $58 billion emergency bailout package 3 weeks later. The won had already lost 30% of its value against the dollar in a matter of weeks and would lose nearly half its value before the crisis bottomed. Unemployment would double within a year. Corporations that had operated for decades collapsed inside a single quarter. Ji-ho's paperwork was legally valid. His apartment still stood. His son was still enrolled. Nothing had been taken from him directly. But every number on every document he had ever signed had been calculated in a currency and an economy that no longer behaved the way those documents assumed. That is where the story of collapse actually begins. Not with the fire, with the arithmetic. The version of economic collapse that lives in most people's imagination arrives loudly. It arrives with images, crowds, chaos, a government podium abandoned mid-sentence. That version exists. But it represents the extreme terminal edge of a process that, for most of its duration, makes no such dramatic announcement. The quieter version looks like this. The grocery store is open, but the price of cooking oil has changed 3 times in 6 weeks. Your bank still has a functioning website, but a wire transfer that once cleared overnight now takes 11 days without explanation. Your salary arrives on schedule, but what it purchases in October is measurably less than what it purchased in March. No single moment announces that something has broken. The machinery of normal life continues running. The brake isn't a calibration. Price signals coordinate everything. They told you what a responsible mortgage looked like relative to your income. They told you what a university degree was worth relative to the labor market it accessed. They told you what your pension contributions would purchase in 30 years. Every long-term financial commitment you have ever made was an answer to a question that price signals posed. When those signals corrupt, when inflation outpaces official acknowledgement, when interest rates detach from actual risk, the answers you gave to those old questions stop fitting the reality you now inhabit. The commitments remain. The logic that produced them does not. That is the mechanism. Not destruction, dislocation. There is a belief so deeply embedded in middle-class financial culture that it has stopped functioning as an opinion and started functioning as gravity. Property always appreciates. Land is finite. Your home is your most reliable asset. These phrases have been passed across generations with the confidence of physical law. They are not physical law. They are assumptions. And assumptions have conditions. Japan stress-tested those assumptions beginning in 1991. After a decade of extraordinary credit expansion, Japanese residential real estate peaked at valuations that, in retrospect, had no mathematical justification. Ordinary families had taken on multi-generational mortgages, contracts spanning 100 years, to purchase modest apartments in Tokyo's suburbs. They were told this was prudent. Prices then fell for over 3 decades. Some markets lost 70% of peak value and have not recovered. The mechanism is not the price decline itself. The mechanism is what the decline reveals. That real estate was never liquid. It felt liquid during the expansion because buyers were plentiful and credit was abundant. The moment credit froze, the buyers disappeared. And a property with no buyers is not an asset you own. It is an obligation you cannot exit. The mortgage payment continues. The property tax continues. The maintenance continues. The market does not. That gap between the ongoing cost of ownership and the complete absence of a functioning exit is where the trap closes. Not with dramatic loss, with paralysis. The car feels like ownership. It sits in your driveway. Your name is on the title. You can see it, touch it, drive it. Of all the purchases the middle class makes on credit, the automobile is the one that most convincingly disguises itself as an asset. It is not an asset. It is a terminal node in an infrastructure network, and that distinction carries no practical weight until the network begins to fail. Venezuela makes the mechanism visible. By 2016, as the economy contracted by more than 30% and inflation exceeded 800% annually, hundreds of thousands of relatively new vehicles sat immobilized across Caracas and Maracaibo. Not because they were damaged, because the network that made them functional had disintegrated. Fuel became scarce despite Venezuela sitting atop the world's largest proven oil reserves. Imported spare parts disappeared as foreign currency reserves collapsed. A set of 4 replacement tires, if locatable, cost more than most workers earned in a year. The car remained. Everything the car required to function was gone. This is the exposure that financed vehicle ownership creates. The loan does not disintegrate with the network. The monthly payment continues to arrive with mechanical indifference, while the fuel to run the vehicle, the parts to maintain it, and the income to service the debt all compress simultaneously. You are left making payments on an object you cannot operate, in a currency losing value, toward a balance that reflects a reality that no longer exists. The metal remains, the utility vanishes, and the debt uniquely stays. The cruelest category is this one. Not because the losses are largest, though sometimes they are, because the people who suffer them are, by every conventional measure, the ones who did everything right. Weimar Germany provides the foundational case. Before World War I, Germany operated one of the most sophisticated pension and life insurance systems in Europe. Middle-class families contributed dutifully into policies denominated in marks, building what they understood to be future security. The hyperinflation of 1921 to 1923 honored every one of those policies technically. The insurance companies paid the face value. The pension administrators delivered the promised figures. The contracts were fulfilled to the letter. A policy worth 20,000 marks in 1914, enough to purchase a substantial property, paid out in 1923 in currency that could not buy a newspaper. Technically whole, practically destroyed. The mechanism is specific. Long-term financial products are not stores of value. They are promises denominated in a currency, managed by an institution, regulated by a government, all 3 of which must remain stable for the promise to deliver what it implied. An economic collapse does not typically break all 3 simultaneously in an obvious way. It erodes them gradually, then decisively. The currency debases. The institution becomes insolvent. The government rewrites the regulatory framework under fiscal pressure. Each individually might be survivable. Together, they eliminate the real value of the product entirely while leaving its nominal structure intact. The statement still arrives. The number on it simply no longer means what it once meant. There is a particular cruelty in this category that the others do not carry. The home, the car, the pension, the degree, these were all framed as investments, as prudent commitments, as evidence of responsible planning. Consumer goods carry no such pretense. They were purchased because the system made purchasing feel like participation. Because consumption, in a functioning consumer economy, is indistinguishable from living. Lebanon illustrates the aftermath with precision. Before 2019, Beirut sustained a retail culture that was, by regional standards, extraordinary. Lebanese households carried significant consumer debt, credit cards, installment agreements, personal loans. Denominated in a currency officially pegged to the dollar and broadly understood to be stable. Families renovated kitchens, furnished apartments, financed electronics. The consumption was real. The stability it assumed was not. When the lira lost more than 90% of its value following the 2019 financial collapse, the debt denominated in that currency did not lose 90% of its obligation. The bills continued arriving. The installment schedules continued demanding payment. But the salaries funding those payments have been gutted in real terms, and the goods those payments were financing, the furniture, the appliances, the renovated interiors, had no resale market, no convertibility, no function in a daily reality increasingly organized around finding bread, fuel, and medicine. This is what consumer debt becomes under collapse. Not a lifestyle. Oh wait, the objects persist. They fill the rooms. They simply have no context left in which to mean anything. The television does not generate income. The sofa cannot be liquidated. And the debt that purchased both remains, demanding settlement from resources that no longer exist to settle it. Step back from the individual categories, and the pattern becomes visible in a way that is difficult to unsee. Real estate, automobiles, long-term financial products, education credentials, consumer goods. These are not randomly selected casualties of economic stress. They are the 5 foundational pillars of middle-class identity in virtually every modern consumer economy across every continent where that class has meaningfully existed. They are the checklist, the culturally mandated sequence of purchases that signals arrival, stability, and responsible participation in the formal economic system. And in collapse after collapse, separated by decades and oceans, they fail together. That simultaneity is not coincidental. It is structural. The middle class occupies a specific and deeply vulnerable position in any formal economy. The wealthy hold diversified assets, frequently across multiple currencies and jurisdictions, structured precisely to survive the failure of any single system. The poor, having never been fully incorporated into the formal financial architecture, are already operating through informal networks, cash transactions, barter, subsistence arrangements that do not depend on institutional stability to function. But the middle class is fully and almost completely integrated. Their wealth is in their mortgage home. Their mobility is in their finance car. Their future is in their institutionally managed pension. Their earning power is credentialed to a specific labor market. Their daily life is sustained by credit finance consumption. Every single thread runs through the formal system. When that system fractures, every thread snaps at once. This is why economic collapse does not destroy the wealthy in relative terms, and does not destroy the poor in relative terms. It destroys the middle class, specifically, mechanically, with a precision that looks almost deliberate but requires no deliberate intent. Only the natural consequence of concentrated exposure to a single systemic risk that the system itself had every incentive to conceal. The instinct to classify economic collapse as something that happens elsewhere. To other governments, other currencies, other populations who made mistakes that more disciplined societies would never make, is not irrational. It is the predictable result of living inside a system that has every structural incentive to present itself as permanent. The historical record does not support that presentation. Carmen Reinhardt and Kenneth Rogoff spent years systematically cataloging 8 centuries of financial crises across dozens of countries. Their findings, published in 2009, documented at least 68 sovereign debt crises and 58 currency crises in the 20th century alone. Not in failed states, not exclusively in the developing world, in economies that, at the moment of their crisis, were considered stable, sophisticated, and structurally sound by the international institutions responsible for monitoring them. Weimar Germany was not a poorly governed backwater. It was the intellectual and cultural center of continental Europe. Argentina, in 1913, ranked among the 10 wealthiest nations on Earth by per capita income, wealthier than France, wealthier than Italy. Lebanon, through the 1960s and into the 1970s, was described by international financial press as the Switzerland of the Middle East, a banking hub, a model of regional stability. Venezuela possessed the largest proven oil reserves on the planet. The severity of what followed in each case was not anticipated by the populations living through the years immediately preceding it. It rarely is. The populations were not uniquely naive. They were operating on the information the system was providing, which consistently understated the fragility that was accumulating beneath the surface. The actuarial implication of that frequency is straightforward. The average adult in a developed economy carries a roughly 1 in 3 probability of living through at least one significant financial crisis during their working lifetime. That figure does not appear in retirement planning literature. It does not appear in mortgage disclosure documents. It is not mentioned by the financial advisors whose compensation depends on continued participation in the products most exposed to systemic risk. The number exists. It is simply never presented alongside the products whose value depends entirely on it remaining theoretical. This analysis does not end with a prescription. The historical record does not yield clean instructions, and anyone who claims otherwise is selling something the record does not support. What it does yield, when examined carefully across multiple collapses in multiple countries across multiple decades, is a set of structural characteristics shared by the people who came through with their material situation meaningfully intact. They were not the wealthiest. They were not the most sophisticated investors. What they shared was a different relationship to concentration and liquidity. They had not placed every consequential asset inside a single system, a single currency, a single institutional framework. They maintained some portion of their resources in forms that did not require an intermediary to access. They had preserved optionality, the practical ability to move, to adapt, to make a different decision when circumstances changed. And critically, they had understood, before the crisis rather than during it, that the commitments they were making were bets, not certainties, and had structured their exposure accordingly. That distinction, between understanding a commitment as a bet and experiencing it as a certainty, is the one that the system surrounding every major financial product is designed to prevent you from making. The mortgage broker, the pension administrator, the insurance agent, the university admissions office, none of them present their product as a wager on systemic stability. They present it as the responsible choice, the safe choice, the choice that people who understand how the world works make without hesitation. Jiho and So understood that in November 1997, 3 weeks before the IMF arrived, every number he had trusted was still printed correctly on every document he held. The documents were intact. The system that gave them meaning was not. What he needed and did not have was not better information about the products. It was a clearer understanding of what the products actually were. That understanding is available. It always has been. It simply requires looking at the historical record with enough honesty to let it say what it actually says.